Maplewood was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, a small town wrapped in a blanket of safety and routine. The streets were lined with neatly kept houses, many of them passed down through generations, and children played freely without fear. People left their cars unlocked in driveways and left spare keys under doormats, confident that nothing bad could happen in their community. It was a town defined by predictability, where local gossip revolved around school sports scores and who was planting what in their garden. Their garden. For years, it had carried the image of a place untouched by the darker parts of the world. That image came crashing down on a cold morning in November 2006, when a crime unlike anything Maplewood had ever experienced shattered its peace. James Berry was the last person anyone expected to meet a violent end. At 34, he was well known throughout town for his work as a mechanic. His small auto repair shop sat on the edge of Main Street, and many residents had trusted him with their cars for years. He was regarded as honest, hardworking, and generous with his time. If someone couldn't afford a repair, James often found ways to help without making them feel embarrassed. He lived alone in a modest two-story house inherited from his late parents, a home that stood just a few blocks from where he grew up. Neighbors described him as a man who kept to himself but always had a friendly nod or wave for those he passed. That November morning began like any other, with the quiet hum of daily life filling the streets. Parents prepared their children for school, commuters grabbed coffee before heading off to work, and elderly residents walked their dogs along the familiar sidewalks. But when James failed to show up at his shop, something felt off. He was known for punctuality, often opening the garage before the sun had fully risen. A customer waiting for their car noticed the closed doors, and soon after, a neighbor mentioned that James's house lights had been on unusually late the night before. Concern grew quickly in a town where unusual behavior was immediately noticed. When police arrived at James's house for a welfare check, they expected to find him sick or possibly injured. Instead, they stumbled upon a scene that would haunt them for years. Inside the living room lay James Berry, lifeless, his body marked by a violent struggle. The room was in disarray, evidence of chaos that had erupted in what was once a quiet home. For officers used to dealing with minor disturbances or the occasional petty theft, the discovery was shocking. News of the murder spread quickly, and within hours, Maplewood was buzzing with fear and speculation. The town that had long prided itself on being safe suddenly felt vulnerable. People who had never locked their doors began to double-check their locks at night. Parents no longer felt as comfortable letting their children roam unsupervised. Neighbors looked at each other differently, questioning whether someone among them could be capable of such brutality. For the first time in memory, Maplewood felt divided between the life it once knew and the frightening uncertainty of what lay ahead. James Berry's murder wasn't just the loss of one man. It was the shattering of an illusion that their town was immune to violence. The crime scene inside James Berry's home told a story that words alone could barely capture. Officers who entered the small living room were met with a sight that was both chaotic and deeply unsettling. The once neat space had been turned into a battlefield. A coffee table was overturned, its legs splintered as though it had been kicked aside in desperation. Shards of glass from broken picture frames littered the carpet, some stained with blood. The television, which had been mounted on the wall, hung at an angle, one bracket ripped free as if someone had been slammed against it. Every detail pointed to a violent struggle that had gone far beyond a quick or calculated attack. This was rage unleashed. James's body was found near the center of the room, and the brutality of his injuries left no doubt that whoever had attacked him intended to cause pain. There were deep cuts across his arms, the kind consistent with someone desperately trying to defend themselves. His face bore bruises from repeated blows, and the blood spatter across the walls suggested he had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. Detectives quickly noted that this was not the work of a careful killer or a stranger trying to get away unnoticed. This was personal. It was a killing fueled by anger rather than by necessity. The absence of forced entry puzzled investigators. The front door showed no signs of tampering, and the locks were still functional. Every window was intact, and there was no evidence of someone breaking in through the back. That meant James had either willingly let his attacker inside, or the killer had access of their own. This detail sent a ripple of unease through detectives because it meant the murderer was likely someone James knew and trusted enough to let into his home. The investigation shifted almost immediately from the possibility of a random act to the grim likelihood that the killer was close to the victim. Even more baffling was what hadn't been touched. In cases of burglary gone wrong, valuables are usually missing: cash, electronics, or even credit cards. But James's wallet sat untouched on the counter, with bills still folded inside. His car keys were by the door and nothing appeared to have been stolen. His house showed signs of violence, but not theft. The motive clearly wasn't financial gain. This discovery cemented the idea that the murder was driven by something deeper: resentment, betrayal, or revenge. The forensic team combed through the house for every possible clue. They dusted for fingerprints on shattered glass, collected fibers from the carpet, and photographed the blood patterns that stretched across the room. A single beer bottle, broken in half and streaked with blood, was collected as possible evidence. It lay only a few feet from James's body, and investigators believed it might have been used as a weapon during the attack. As night fell on Maplewood, the once quiet house was surrounded by flashing police lights and curious neighbors peering from behind curtains. For them, it was unthinkable that such violence had erupted within walking distance of their own homes. For the detectives, it was the start of a grueling search for answers hidden in the fragments of that chaotic room. As detectives began piecing together James Barry's final days, the image of a man with no enemies started to crumble. At first, everyone who knew James described him as kind, generous, and patient. But as investigators dug deeper, a different side of his life slowly emerged. Behind the cheerful greetings at his shop and the reputation for honesty was a man who had been tangled in conflicts that no one in Maplewood had openly spoken about. He had been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Claire who had lived with him in the same house for nearly 3 years. The split had been sudden and, according to those close to them, bitter. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments late at night, shouting that carried through the thin walls of their quiet street. When Claire left town shortly before the murder, many assumed the relationship was simply over. But police learned that she had left feeling angry and resentful, convinced that James had betrayed her trust. The timing was too close to ignore, and her name immediately went on the list of potential suspects. But Claire was not the only person who had clashed with James. Investigators discovered that James had been entangled in a financial dispute with a former business partner. Years earlier, he had tried to expand his repair shop by going into partnership with a friend named Jason Holloway. At first, it seemed like a promising venture, but disagreements over money quickly soured the relationship. When the business failed, accusations flew in both directions. James claimed Jason owed him thousands of dollars, while Jason insisted James had mismanaged their finances. Their friendship ended in bitterness, and though they no longer worked together, witnesses described seeing heated exchanges between them long after the partnership collapsed. Detectives also uncovered troubling whispers about James's personal habits. Though well-liked, he was known to enjoy drinking late into the night, and some suggested that alcohol often fueled his temper. A few customers recalled him losing his patience during stressful moments, something that clashed with the friendly image most people knew. Police began to wonder if James had been involved in more arguments than anyone had realized. Each small revelation chipped away at the idea that his death was a mystery without motive. The most haunting part for investigators was that each lead revealed someone who had a reason to resent James. His ex-girlfriend, bitter and distant, had walked away but might not have let go of her anger. His former business partner, still weighed down by debt and humiliation, had reasons to lash out. Even the occasional bar fights or late-night arguments hinted at enemies James may not have even considered dangerous. The picture became more complex with every interview. What struck detectives most was the contrast between how James was seen publicly and what was happening privately. To the town, he was the trusted mechanic who fixed cars at fair prices. To those closer to him, he was a man caught in conflicts that seemed small until they were examined under the shadow of his murder. Each new discovery suggested that someone in his circle had reached a breaking point, and that the attack in his living room was not random, but the result of festering anger. Finally, weeks slipped by, and the investigation into James Barry's death seemed to stall. Detectives interviewed friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have had contact with him, but every lead felt like a dead end. The town grew restless as silence replaced certainty. Rumors filled the gaps in knowledge, with some blaming strangers passing through Maplewood and others pointing fingers at those closest to James. It wasn't until forensic results returned from the state lab that the investigation shifted in a new direction, offering detectives their first real breakthrough. Among the shattered glass and bloodstains inside James's living room, crime scene technicians had collected a broken beer bottle. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of debris from the chaos of the attack. But when fingerprints were lifted from the bottle's neck, they matched someone already in the criminal database: Jason Holloway. The name was familiar to investigators because Jason had once been James's business partner, the same man who had clashed with him over money. Suddenly, what had seemed like an unresolved grudge became a clear connection to the crime scene. Detectives wasted no time tracking Jason down. He was living on the outskirts of town in a run-down apartment that bore little resemblance to the life James had managed to build. When questioned, Jason admitted he had known James but claimed he hadn't seen him in weeks. He insisted he'd been at a friend's house the night James was killed. But when officers checked his alibi, details quickly unraveled. The friend he claimed to have been with gave a conflicting story, and timelines failed to match. Jason's nervous demeanor and shifting answers only raised more suspicion. As police dug deeper into Jason's background, they uncovered a troubling pattern. Since the collapse of his partnership with James, Jason had struggled financially. He had been in and out of low-paying jobs, often relying on others to make ends meet. Debt collectors were after him, and court records showed he had been sued multiple times for unpaid bills. Witnesses came forward saying Jason had been overheard complaining about James, blaming him for the failure of their repair business and for his downward spiral. In bars and small gatherings, Jason had allegedly referred to James as someone who ruined his life. Phone records added another layer to the case. Investigators discovered that Jason's cell phone had pinged a tower near James's house on the night of the murder. Though it wasn't proof of guilt by itself, combined with the fingerprint evidence and his collapsing alibi, the picture became darker. Detectives began to suspect that Jason hadn't just visited James that night, he had confronted him, and the encounter turned violent. Word spread quickly through Maplewood when Jason was brought in for further questioning. The town that had been divided by speculation now had a name and a face to focus on. Still, there was unease. While the evidence pointed strongly to Jason, the brutality of the crime left many wondering if the story was really that simple. Was it truly just a dispute between former friends that spiraled out of control, or was there something even more sinister buried beneath the surface? The trial of Jason Holloway drew crowds from across Maplewood and beyond, each person eager to hear how the mystery of James Barry's murder would finally be resolved. The courtroom was packed, with every seat filled and reporters standing at the back. For many, this was more than a legal proceeding. It was the climax of weeks of fear, gossip, and unanswered questions. People wanted to understand how someone who had once been James's friend could have unleashed such brutal violence. The prosecution presented a detailed timeline of events leading up to the night of the murder. They described Jason's financial struggles, his resentment over the failed repair shop, and his growing anger toward James. The fingerprint on the broken beer bottle became the centerpiece of their case. Experts testified that the print was fresh and that the bottle was covered in blood consistent with the injuries James had sustained. Combined with the cell phone data showing Jason near the house at the time of the killing, the evidence painted a damning picture. Witnesses were called to the stand who recalled hearing Jason speak bitterly about James in the weeks before the murder. Some remembered him slurring angry words in bars. Others said he had made veiled threats about getting even. The defense, however, tried to cast doubt. They argued that Jason had indeed been to James's house before, but claimed the fingerprint on the bottle could have come from an earlier visit. They insisted there was no direct proof tying him to the fatal attack. They highlighted the lack of DNA evidence on Jason himself and suggested that investigators had rushed to judgment, eager to close a case that had rattled the town. Jason sat at the defense table looking worn, his hands clenched tightly, shaking his head as accusations mounted. Despite the defense's efforts, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The jury listened intently as prosecutors described the savage nature of the assault, portraying it not as a calculated act, but as an explosion of fury. The argument between the two men, they explained, had spiraled out of control when James demanded repayment of money Jason had long avoided. Fueled by alcohol and simmering resentment, Jason had lashed out violently, grabbing whatever he could find to use as a weapon. The attack left James with fatal injuries, and Jason fled the scene in panic, leaving behind the fingerprint that would ultimately betray him. When the verdict was read, the room was silent. Jason Holloway was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words carried a finality that left Jason staring blankly ahead, his future sealed by the weight of his actions. For James's friends and family, the verdict brought some measure of closure, though the pain of his loss lingered. Maplewood was never the same after the trial. The town that once prided itself on safety now carried the memory of betrayal and violence within its borders. Neighbors locked their doors at night, parents kept closer watch over their children, and every friendly face was seen with a trace of suspicion. James Barry's death became a permanent scar on the town's history, a reminder that darkness can rise even in the most familiar places, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those once considered friends.